Hello, ngHouston. Except today it's not actually Houston. We're live streaming from Amsterdam. So I should say hello, Amsterdam. Except we're not in Amsterdam. We're out in the boonies out of Amsterdam, where it's peaceful. Today we have a great show. We actually have a double header today. We have John Rista from Breebug talking about ngrx-auto-entity, which is brand new, and this is the debut, and I'm super excited about this. So he's going to show us everything. But in the meantime, I want to show you Kyler Johnson. Kyler, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
And Kyler, can we throw up the baby pictures one more time? So Sam and I met Kyler. Kyler, we've known you for a while now. I want to say we met you in Atlanta, but we knew you before that, right?
Yeah.
Twitter friends.
Online. We were online friends before that.
We were online friends, and then we met in Atlanta, and we had a lot of fun. And Kyler is super cool, and he was a lot of fun. And Kyler just had a baby. So I demanded baby pictures as his toll. Like you to come on into Houston, but you have to bring us baby pictures.
Yeah, I closed them out here, so I'm reopening real quick. Won't take but a second.
Sorry, I should have warned you. I should have said keep them open. I just make it up as I go along sometimes.
It's all good. Almost there. Okay, and just share my screen here.
Tell us her name again, Kyler.
Her name is Avonlea.
And what's her mama's name?
Abby. Yeah. Can you see that?
Oh, I love the sunglasses. That's so great.
Yeah, we're really excited.
She's cute.
She's cute.
I think so.
Okay, so John Rista has another kind of baby that he's been working on.
Yeah.
So John, before you tell us about Kyler, can you turn off your screen? There you go. Before you show us, can you tell us about this ngrx-auto-entity? Like, tell us first, like, where did this idea come from?
So the idea originally came from Jesse, CEO of Breebug, and it was more just the idea of let's have some generic actions so we can stop writing new actions every time we need to create a new entity and do stuff with it. And that idea kind of morphed into the auto-entity library we have today, just kind of as a matter of consequence, I guess, more than anything. As we got into it and as we started playing around with the idea of generic actions, there was still a lot of work involved in writing effects and then writing reducers. And we're like, well, why don't we just take care of all of it and do it all automatically? And that's kind of how the library came about. And there were a few challenges we had to overcome while working through this. In particular, how to find a service that is used to actually handle an entity, or how to find the right effects to handle an entity. And a lot of interesting stuff kind of came out of it, and learned a lot about ngrx and Angular and those kind of things as we worked along. So it's been fun.
So you took all of this expertise that you and Jesse have been doing ngrx and helping clients with ngrx for a while. So you've seen ngrx in the wild in many different scenarios.
Oh,
so
yeah.
You took all that experience and rolled it into what not to do, what to do. Make it easier?
It kind of evolved organically. Just sort of, we started simple, and we've been working on this since late last year, fall, pretty much. And it sort of evolved organically over time, particularly with me working on it, because I was the one key person who was using it in an actual product. And it sort of changed in.
I don't know if he's frozen or if I'm frozen.
I think he hanged up.
Hello. I think that's me.
John, you froze for a second. Can you go back a minute?
My apologies. I have some funky internet things going on today. So I'm the one guy who's actually been using this kind of as we've gone in an actual real world product. So a lot of this library has evolved over time as I've found needs and what I'm actually using it for in an actual real world product with both an Angular site for administrative purposes that runs on the web, as well as an app that runs on a phone. So it's got a lot of features that we hope are really going to be useful in real world life.
So can I ask you, without being too competitive, right? Because we know NGRX data has been out there for a while, and I know you guys were big fans of NGRX data, and you know Ward Bell and John Papa watch our show, obviously, right?
Yes.
So
yes. Oh, and we're still
like,
big fans of dead data. You know, we're not really trying to replace
Yeah.
data. It's just an alternative solution to the same general problem. So.
What was there anything like? Did you, because you guys, I think I would imagine because the Breebug guys are pretty rock stars, that you guys are probably pushing NGRX data to its limits. Was there, like, did you find a spot where it wasn't serving your needs anymore, or it was just a different way to approach the same problem?
A kind of a different way to approach the same problem. I think the main difference people will find with ngrx-auto-entity versus ngx data is data kind of takes this config-based approach, which is a little out of the norm for how you develop Angular and NGRX applications. And one of the goals I've had with creating this library is to keep it familiar and keep it simple. Make sure we're following standards that already exist. So an example would be how you register a service for a particular entity. NGRX data provides its own mechanism for doing that, that's sort of separate and distinct from how you would normally register with Angular. And one of the goals I've had with auto-entity is to keep it familiar and keep it following existing standards. So when you register a service for an entity, you're actually using existing functionality in Angular to do it. And that was just kind of it's just a different approach. You know, we don't think it'll de-seat, you know, NGRX data or replace it in any way. We're hoping it'll just kind of meet the needs of a different kind of thought process or a different kind of problem in the future.
So would you say maybe writing the code, so like NGRX data like, kind of will write the code for you, and then auto-entity maybe make it so that you actually require less code?
I don't know that we're really going to require less code than NGRX data. Data is pretty minimal code. I mean, it gives you the ability, if you're using it for a simple purpose, it's almost zero code. You put together a really basic configuration and it does nothing. One thing we do is provide kind of prefabricated facades, base classes. And that's kind of where this presentation will end up, is showing you some of the facade stuff. And that's one thing we hope that will really help people, especially beginners, kind of roll into using state, because we're providing a layer between your application, all your components, and the NGRX store via this layer of facades you can build. And we're hoping that'll actually make it a lot easier to use state in general.
I think we'll have to see it, John.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's sounding pretty good. I like it. Of course, you know how I love that NGRX boilerplate. I just really like to write a lot of actions and reducers, and it's fun.
Yeah. And there are still solutions. I mean, if you don't want to do this automatic approach, you know, there are some schematics you can use to generate code.
I mean, I really like to write a lot of code. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, we're hoping. We'll see if we can change the world.
Okay, so you're going to share your screen?
Yep. Let me get that all rolling here.
And I'm going to make you the presenter, and you can show us how it works.
All right. How's that look?
This looks awesome.
All right. So since I have already introduced what it is, my name is John Rista, and I'm a senior engineer and architect at Breebug. I'm working with Jesse Sanders for probably about 4 or 5 years with Breebug, and I've known him for about a decade here. So
shout out Jesse Sanders.
Yeah, good guy. He's a really good
so
guy.
Great.
All right, so before we dive into this, there are a few things we expect you'll know. Of course, Angular 6 or greater. We kind of built this on a foundation of Angular 6, which was when the libraries were first introduced. We will be trying to make sure it works with 7 and 8 and 9 as we go forward. We do expect you'll know RxJS reactive extension for JavaScript. This is kind of a key prerequisite because you'll still be using pipe and operators to augment your streams as necessary. And then, of course, ngrx itself, that's what this library is supposed to support and augment. And then we do love ngrx. I may use some terms like boilerplate here, but I did want to shout out to Mike Ryan, Brennan Roberts, and Bob Marmold for their wonderful framework, because ngrx is pretty freaking awesome. It's something we really love at Breebug.
We pick on them because we love them. Really, the more I say boilerplate, every time I say boilerplate, it's like a hug for Mike and Brandon, really.
They'll learn as a hug one of these days.
You'll take the hug whether you like it or not. I think there's a code of conduct violation there somewhere.
So while we do love it, there are some issues with ngrx as it exists. First of all, there's a very high volume of prerequisite code. This is probably most often seen with actions. I mean, when you get down to the business of creating a new action, or even just creating a set of actions to support the use of a new entity in your application, there's a lot of code involved. You got to take care of entity enums, action classes, action types, and union type to take care of making sure you can use those actions in a reducer properly. It's a lot of little pieces that go into making state work with ngrx as it exists today. So that kind of leads to a moderate to high level of complexity. It's not always a high level of complexity, but there's a decent amount of complexity in creating all the effects, the reducers, and making sure all these different pieces are wired together properly with baseline ngrx. There's also a high degree of decoupling, and this kind of is where some code is in one place in your application, other code is in another place, and it's not really directly linked to each other. It's very decoupled. When you dispatch an action, there is not a direct call from the action to an effect, for example, or from an effect directly calling into a reducer. There's a lot of decoupling, and that kind of makes it a little more abstract and harder to understand, especially for beginners, which is definitely an audience I want to target here. And then there's often a high dispersion of code throughout the code base. You have actions in one area, effects and reducers in another, and then you're dispatching actions and subscribing to selectors all throughout your entire code base. So this ngrx stuff disperses throughout your whole code base rather than kind of being encapsulated in a particular area. And so these are things we kind of are hoping to solve with ngrx-auto-entity. To kind of recap, out-of-the-box experience, a lot of little pieces, a lot of stuff going on all at once. Some things you kind of can't get away from, a state interface and reducer map. We tried to get rid of those, but we felt that kind of stick with some of our tenants, which I'll go into in a moment here. Keeping those around was good. And then models and services are something that the developer is always been responsible for, and we didn't really want to change some of these low-level fundamental aspects. So auto-entity, which we kind of try to call the pleasant experience, reduces all that stuff to just initialization and then some of the standard things you're already familiar with doing. And as Bonnie brought up earlier, there are some other solutions that solve this problem. There are Angular CLI schematics. These are command line tools that hook into the existing ng CLI, and you can generate the necessary actions and often kind of boilerplate reducers and maybe even effects with schematics at the command line. Brebo actually provides ngx, what do we call it here? I thought I had a note for that.
Schematics?
I think it's ngx entity schematic, yeah. So you can go to /ngrx-entity-schematic. It's an NPM package written by Kevin Stuchard, who's also a Bribug developer. And this provides a pretty rich set of existing CLI schematics that'll generate a lot of NGRX stuff for you, and that can reduce the workload quite a bit. If you're using VS Code, there's also something called IDE snippets, and these allow you to type out a simple code in your actual source code files and hit tab, and it'll kind of expand into a whole new action for you or something along those lines. You can actually find that. I'm losing my place here. You can actually find that online. It's called VS Code-NGRX snippets, and it's actually pretty useful if you're using VS Code. And then, of course, there's NGRX data, which will soon become a part of NGRX itself, and this is config-driven and is also encapsulated and automated. The config-driven approach was one of the things that we kind of took a different angle on with auto-entity, and something we hope that will appeal to people looking for a different solution in NGRX data. We're hoping that our approach is more functional, dynamic, and flexible. We have tried not to change anything that exists or how things will work with NGRX or Angular today. We're trying to stick with the existing patterns, existing standards. We want to remain familiar. So everything you know with NGRX today still applies with ngrx-auto-entity. And we're actually hoping that we can provide options for you to simplify any custom use cases you may have, where you can extend our library, utilize some of the stuff we provide to reduce the amount of work you have to do in the future for very custom use cases of NGRX. We aim to enhance and not replace NGRX. This is a library, and it's an add-on for NGRX, and we're not really hoping to change any of that. And we offer a number of simplifications and improvements to NGRX. And we'll get into some of that later on. A big one there is these prefabricated facades. All right, our architecture. We have a number of goals with ngrx. As I mentioned, it's an add-on library. We provide a pretty large and rich set of generic actions, which I'll get into a little bit here. These generic actions, we think, can probably cover the vast majority of use cases for actions in general. They've been designed in such a way that they can provide a pretty flexible layer between your code and interacting with various backends. We have a set of reusable effects, so you don't even have to write an effect anymore with this library. It takes care of that for you. We also have a shared meta reducer, and this reduces all actions that use generic actions. And as long as you use generic actions for all of your entities, you don't have to write any reducers. We stick with familiar patterns, so everything you know about NGRX today, you'll keep using that knowledge. We've simply added some additional functionality on top of NGRX. We've remained standardized, so we have not introduced any different or alternative ways of doing things like registering a service or linking that service to a model. We actually leverage existing Angular functionality for that. And then a key tenet is be flexible. So if you ever do need to create a custom action of your own and create a custom effect of your own, we wanted to make sure that if you needed to, you could still take whatever entities you receive back from a server and plug them into our existing state and use our reducer to reduce that state. And just some of our tenets here. We really want to make NGRX work for you rather than having you work for NGRX. All right, so some of the functionality we provide. We provide a number of state preparation utilities. The big one, as you'll see in the first line of the example code here, is build state. Oops. This is kind of our core function, and this is what does most of the work for you. When you call build state and you pass it a type, it's actually the class for your entity. It will generate a whole bunch of information for you, including initial state, selectors, a facade-based class, and even a reducer that can be used in some circumstances. Our library provides a large collection of reusable actions, and this includes things like loads, and we actually allow you to load information in a pretty wide range of different ways. Single entities, lists of entities, pages or ranges of entities. And each of these different actions, these different load actions, has their own unique semantics. We have ready-made effects. Is there a question?
No, I was on mute.
Oh, okay. We have a bunch of ready-made effects. We have an entity effects set of effect functions that'll handle everything you can possibly do with ngrx-auto-entity. We also provide a set of broken down effects classes so that you can choose which types of entities you actually are handling through auto-entity, allowing you to take control over parts of the process if you need to. So if you want to handle all the loads and then have auto-entity take care of all the create, update, and delete stuff for you, you can do that.
Hey, I do have a question, John.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple of questions. And because we have a lot of beginners that watch this, right? And I know Kyler and I have been doing NGRX for a while, and I'm sure some of our viewers have too. It's been out for a while, but a lot of people are still wrapping their heads around it. So can you define entity as you're using it in this? Like, what is an entity, and then what is a state?
Yeah, so I'll get into that in a moment in more detail. But an entity is let's just take it at a conceptual level. It is something you need to work with that represents a specific set of information. So a customer or a product or an order would all be considered entities. And each entity has a unique set of, a unique key and then unique information about that particular entity that gives it, it makes it unique and gives it a purpose in your product. So that's the concept of what I mean by entity. With ngrx-auto-entity, entities are also classes. I'll be getting into that in a moment here and kind of give some more detail about how entity models work with ngrx-auto-entity. Does that cover it well enough?
So basically, an entity is like a thing, whatever thing or things is used. Like, if you're a mechanic, it's going to be a car. If you're a vet, it's going to be an animal, or
Right.
So it's going to be whatever object it is that you're. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. It's the concepts that basically drive your application. It's the information you're working with in your application. But it's not just dispersed information. It's information that's encapsulated in a specific form, I guess is the best way to call it.
Yeah. Well, I think when I first started with some of this stuff, and I was self-taught, right? So some of the words that I heard people saying is like, well, I don't know that word, and so I can't follow you. But then when you explain it, it's like, oh, well, that's so simple. That's not
Thank you,
confusing.
thank you for asking. Yeah, because I mean, we use that word a lot, and it's actually important to make sure people are understanding what we're talking about. So yes. Did you have another question or just the one?
Not yet, but I will.
Okay. I mentioned before we have a shared meta reducer. So this reducer is kind of it's sort of a hidden aspect of ngrx-auto-entity. There's only one place where you actually touch it, and we'll get into that shortly here. But it does actually a lot of work. It reduces every single action you dispatch that comes from the auto-entity library. So it's a pretty interesting piece of code. And you can go ahead and hop in and take a look on GitHub, and actually I'll share that URL later on. But we have one reducer that pretty much takes care of everything. We also have one set of effects for that takes care of everything, which is kind of an interesting aspect of this library. In addition to the state preparation utilities, we also have key generation utilities. These are just functions that help you generate keys that are used with our library. The reason we have those will become apparent shortly here. We've taken an approach that is similar to how Angular works, and so we use some decorators in a couple places. That's why some of these utilities are necessary. And then finally, we have entity facades, and this is probably the aspect I'm most excited about with this framework is pre-generated facade-based classes and the functionality that it provides and the organization we hope that'll provide to your code base.
This is the part I'm excited. You are going to show that to us today, right?
Oh yes, yeah, it's kind of near the end. Save the best for last.
Man. I was like, I want to see it.
Yeah, save the best for last, so it'll be last. And then hopefully, if we have time, I kind of wanted to get into some code to show you guys. But we'll see.
I definitely would like to see the code. Don't forget, we have a double header today, so we have a stop.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm not sure how much time we'll have for that. So.
Well, I'll stop interrupting you.
Okay. So there are some things that are still up to the developer. We call those the developer responsibility. We try to do as much as we can for you. We try to reduce the workload as much as possible. You know, ng module stuff, that's pretty standard. You'll still be doing that, and it'll be done exactly the same way you do it today. We haven't changed that at all. Setting up your state interface, that'll mostly be the same. There's some changes there that'll actually hopefully simplify things for you. The reducer map is pretty much identical. It's still a developer responsibility. And then the key things are defining entity models and implementing entity services. These are things you've always taken care of. You'll always take care of these yourself. However, we're hoping that we've made those a little easier as well. So some of the ngrx or ng module stuff, you are still responsible for importing libraries. This includes auto-entity. Make sure you import that into your application module, and probably in the lazy loaded modules as well. You must still import ngrx itself, so make sure you bring in your store module and your effects module. We usually put that in the state module, but we're not actually trying to impose any particular patterns here, so import those wherever you need them. And then you must also register our auto effects. So I mentioned this before, we actually have a bunch of options here. Going into the details of these options is something that I want to save for another presentation. To start, for most people, just bringing in entity effects and plugging those into the effects module is enough to get our effects rolling. So there are standard things with ngrx you're still going to have to do. You are still going to have to define an app state interface. Call it whatever you will. There are some simplifications there. You don't need to define interfaces for each of your state anymore. We actually provide an interface that you can use. I think I actually had an example before here. Notice on our entity reducer here, I'm returning iEntity state of type entity. This little interface takes care of interfaces for all your state if you're using iEntity for that particular state. And you can fill your app interface with a bunch of properties that just implement iEntity state for each model. You still need to create your app reducer, and you'll still need to configure that the same as you always have. One small change here is you're going to bring in our auto-entity meta reducer from the library and plug that in both your development and production meta reducer maps. This is where a lot of the magic occurs with auto-entity. And then, of course, update your state module to bring in your app reducer and your meta reducers. Standard stuff. All right, so Bonnie, you asked about entity models. These are staying pretty much the same. There are some small changes we do require with models. Previously, models were usually defined as an interface. An interface is a compile time only construct in TypeScript. With auto-entity, we actually need some runtime information about your models to be able to do what we're doing. So we need you to change your interfaces to classes for each of your models. A class is a first class, pardon the pun, element in ECMAScript. So you've been able to create classes in ECMAScript and JavaScript for some time now, going all the way back to, I think, ES6. And we actually leverage that functionality and that capability of ECMAScript to support what we're doing. One other change you'll need to do is, instead of using a function to define your key, we actually have a decorator called @key. You simply decorate the property that is your key, or if you have a composite key, you just decorate all the properties that are involved in your key. And then ngrx-auto-entity takes care of the rest. So this is one of the areas we're trying to remain familiar and kind of stick with existing patterns. People who are doing Angular development know about decorators, they're familiar with decorators, and we felt this was a pretty nice use case for a decorator. And it also, I think, helps kind of make your code a little more self-descriptive. It clearly calls out what the key of your model is in the code. The other big developer responsibility is entity services, and this is the path to the backend. Backend really may be anything. One of the reasons we left this as primarily a developer responsibility was to make sure you could integrate with any kind of backend, not just the standard REST API, but even Firebase or other possible backends, maybe even existing third-party backends. And we were hoping that we provided the necessary facilities to make sure you can do that. Big change with entity services with auto-entity is you must implement this auto-entity service interface, which is generic. It can be used as any, or it can be used with a specific entity, and I'll get into why that is in a minute here. This interface is kind of an interesting interface. It's not really a hard contract. Every method it describes is actually optional. That allows you to implement just what you need for each entity. Some entities you may only need to load, and you may never save them. And if that's the case, you'd only have to implement one of the load methods that actually supports your code. So each of these methods has access to something we call rich entity info. This entity info object has a representation of the model type as well as the model name. And one of the small improvements we're going to be making soon here is it's also going to provide pluralization as well as casing functions to reconfigure that name into one of a variety of forms as necessary so you can call your APIs properly. You also have access to custom criteria. This criteria is actually initially provided in the actions. It can be anything you want, and it's there to facilitate complex backend UIs. Something I like to do myself when I'm building an API, which I usually do with Node and Nest.js, and I'm absolutely loving Nest.js. But I like to build hierarchical APIs. So I may have a customer's entity that is at /customers, and you may find a single customer at customer/ID. If I want to find the orders for that particular customer, I might throw /orders on the end of that existing URL. So with hierarchical structures like that, I found the need to actually be able to provide parent keys or information about the parent structure or the hierarchical structure of my entities, which is largely where criteria came from. So it provides a lot of flexibility, though, and hopefully will allow you to integrate with any backend of any kind. Another big change with auto-entity is services must be provided in a pretty unique manner. And if you look at this code here, you might be wondering what's going on. We've imported customer, line item, order, and product from models, and we're providing our models. We've also imported all of our services from services, and then we're using this use class nomenclature here. This is actually standard Angular provider functionality, and this is one of the things I worked quite a bit on trying to solve this little problem. It wasn't as easy as it seemed at first, but this allows you to use existing dependency injection and inversion of IOC functionality in Angular's container to register and provide your services using information ngrx-auto-entity has access to. Key here is our library only knows about your models. If we go back for a moment here, notice here when we build state, we're passing in a model. This is one of those model classes. Build state's the core user access point, developer access point to our library, and the only piece of information you're providing it, or the key piece of information you're providing it, is the entity model itself. So that's our internal key, and that's what we have to use to find and do everything else we need to do with our library. So we're providing our models, and then we're using class for the services. This allows us to map from a model, which is the only thing AutoEntity knows about, to the actual service that should be used to handle API calls for that particular model. And this actually allows us to do something pretty cool. It allows us to share entity services among entities. So if you have a very simple API, let's say an API that follows a very strict pattern, /API/customer, /API/line item, /API/order. If you have a very simple model like that for your API, you can write one single entity service that utilizes the information available in the interface we provide to make every call dynamically to all your APIs in one single service. So for beginners, this is one thing where we're really hoping this will help beginners get rolling with this and with NGRX in general, because it just reduces the workload quite a bit without taking a whole lot of control away from you. Okay, so save the best for last. Entity facades. If you went to ngConf this year, or if you've been reading any of Thomas Burleson's articles over the last year, you may be familiar with facades. This is actually an ancient pattern from probably even before I even got into development, which was in the 80s. A facade is a simplified API into a larger body of APIs or a library. And with facades, I mentioned before, there's a high dispersion of NGRX code throughout an application. You have actions in one area, you have your effects and reducers in another area, and then you're dispatching these and watching selections all over the place in your application. With facades, you can kind of consolidate a lot of that usage into one layer of your application and get it out of the rest of your app.
I love the facade pattern.
It's a great pattern. And this is one of the great things that I think TypeScript has brought to the web development world, is it gives us the structure to kind of implement a lot of these patterns that have been around for so long. I mean, a facade is not really a new thing. It's just new in the web. It's a really solid pattern that's been used on, with compiled backend languages for decades. And there are other patterns that I'm hoping we can start utilizing in our implementations on the front end. A lot of that's thanks to TypeScript and the ability to really do rich classes and things like that. So,
absolutely. And I think the facade, especially when it's used with NGRX, because to me, the whole point of the facade pattern is to hide all that complexity, and it's still there, but really all of your imports and all these actions and reducers, all that kind of stuff is just, you don't need to pull all those imports into every single component, and it's so beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah, it's wonderful. We love this pattern. Well, let me say I love this pattern in particular. I'm actually kind of evangelizing that Rebug as well. So
I'm with you, John.
So this presents a really simplified API into state. State is pretty complicated and complex, so we hope this pattern, the fact that we're auto-generating a facade base classes for you, will really help you kind of get into this new mode of using a reactive state in your applications. And we generate a base facade class with our build state function for you. So if you look at the example code above here, we need to call build state, to which you provide an entity class. And note that we're providing the class here. This is not an instance of an entity. This is the class, the type itself. And just to know, you are also able to provide some of your own custom and initial state here as well. There's a second argument. We provide initial state selectors, and then also this entity state, which I'll get into in a moment. And then we provide a facade base class. Technically speaking, this is a full class that you could actually provide directly and not extend if you wanted to. However, we actually recommend this extension approach as it gives you the ability to add your own functionality to the facades for your entities. And that's probably more what I'll get into in another future presentation. But this is really how you're going to leverage the power of AutoEntity. Oh, it looks like I do have some basic things here. So if you do extend an entity facade base class that's provided by AutoEntity, you can then add your own functionality to it. So if you need to capture an entity, for example, and we do this pattern a lot, where you'll pipe something and then tap, and you'll save off a copy of whatever it is you're getting out of a particular observable to a property on the component you're working with, for example. I call those captures, and you can easily encapsulate that capture functionality into a function on your entity facade. The entity base facade provides update and create methods. A lot of us like to follow a save pattern, though, and that's something you could easily implement in your facades. And then we do think this is the way of the future. We think facades are going to change how people use NGRX in general, and hopefully it'll be a big simplification and overall for using NGRX and using reactive state in general in your applications. So We're hoping that this particular feature that we're providing is the big one, and this is the main draw for our library. Okay, so what time is it here? Okay, looks like I have some time. So auto-entity is more than just a set of generic CRUD actions. Our ultimate goal is really to do state, not just entities. So while entities is a big focus, obviously, we're providing more than just state. A big thing is loading. It's not just load an entity or load all entities. We provide actually a range of load actions, as well as all the functionality involved in making those actions work. Of course, you can load single, many, or all. We also provide load actions to load pages of information or ranges of information. Now, each of these actions has unique semantics and behavior. If you load all, you're going to load every single entity you've got from your backend. We're going to plug them all into state. That'll replace whatever entities you had in state before. If you use load many, on the other hand, load many is designed to allow you to load in chunks or load in pieces, and we will merge that information into state. With pages and ranges, it's kind of similar. If you load a page, by design, those actions are going to wipe out whatever entities you already have in state and replace them with the page you've loaded. And the reason we do that is if you're using paging, you're probably working with a very large data set. It could be millions of records, it could be billions of records, or even more. We don't want to load that kind of information in the state. So load pages allows you to easily grab 100 records, 1,000 records, bring them in chunks, and then when you bring in the next page, we wipe out whatever state you've had and replace it with a new set of pages. Ranges, on the other hand, support things like infinite scrolling, where you'll load consecutive sets of data, one after the other, as you scroll. And so the semantics between loading a page and loading a range are different. And this is all encapsulated in the action you use to do these actions, to invoke these behaviors. We also cover other common ngrx usage patterns, like selecting or deselecting an entity in state. When you use the identity state interface to describe the structure of the state, we actually provide a whole lot of information there, and hopefully I'll have a chance to get into code and show you some of this. But selecting and deselecting is actually built into auto-entity. You can dispatch select, you can dispatch deselect, and it'll actually update state, and we just track a current entity ID as well as a current entity object, and we'll clear those when you do a deselection. And then, of course, we also provide selectors so you can actually access that information. We also have a clear action that'll wipe out anything in state and reset it back to an initial state, basically. When you dispatch our actions, we track both flags and timestamps for loading, saving, and deleting. So if you're loading a large set of entities, we'll actually set a loading flag to true. And when it has loaded, we'll set the loaded at timestamp for you. And there are a bunch of selectors that allow you to retrieve that information as well. And then we do have a whole bunch of future goals. There's a lot more to come with auto-entity. This is an evolving library and concept, and we're also open to feedback from the community about things that you need. I mean, things you found in the real-world practice that you think you could encapsulate in ngrx and simplify your life a little bit. Some key things we want to provide are toasts and snack bars for CRUD operations. When you dispatch a save, for example, we want to have another add-on library that'll allow you to just wire in toast for those automatically. We'll do it with the decorator approach at toast or something like that on the model, and allow you to display those without any need to write effects or wire that stuff up yourself. We're probably going to provide material and bootstrap libraries and maybe some of these other upcoming frameworks. A couple of these new frameworks are showing up for CSS. I can't remember some of the names right now, but there's some interesting things coming along the line for CSS and layout libraries. We also want to provide better integrated plurality. So the iEntity info interface currently provides a model type and the model name. We want to provide some plural functions on there so you can automatically convert a singular name into a plural name, which is often required when interacting with backend APIs. We want to provide some prefabricated entity services. Since entity services can be shared among entities, we figure there's probably a lot of use for ready-made services that follow certain patterns, and we're hoping to provide those in the future. And the big one, and this is one of the most complicated aspects of building a library like this, is making it so you can configure effect behaviors. This gets down to the mapping operators, which I've actually got an article coming on soon here. Switch map versus exhaust map versus concat map versus merge map. This has kind of been a point of contention a little bit in the community, and I think it's also been a point of confusion. You know, it's like, what mapper do you use? And it's something we want to make a little easier for people who are using reactive state, is the ability to use a more descriptive term to describe what kind of behavior and semantics you want to be involved when you're invoking side effects.
You know you've really made it in the Angular community when Shai makes a conference talk about you.
What was that?
I said, you know you've really made it as an RxJS operator when Shai Resnick makes a conference talk about you.
Yeah. So I personally, I think there's a place for every single one of those mapping operators. Switch map's kind of been shunned, and it's sort of off the table. Exhaust map's kind of going the same way. I find a use for every single one of them, and there are different cases where you'll use different operators, and I want to make sure that you can actually configure that with auto-entity in the future. It's a challenging problem to solve when you're trying to do it in an automated fashion, so I can't say when that feature will arrive. But I want to make sure that we can actually provide an easier way to decide what behavior you want the effects to use for particular entities. And I have an article coming that hopefully will kind of clarify what I mean by that very soon here. And then we want to provide more generic actions. If there's a common use case that the community generally uses a particular kind of action for, we want to make sure we provide that, because we are more about just not just entities, but actions in general and state in general. So, and I think that's about it for the presentation. Thanks a lot. And a few credits. So.
I was trying to come back and I was muted there.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, keep going.
Just a few credits to people who helped with this and for some of the other things in the community. Jesse Stannis for the idea for generic actions in the first place. It was really funny when he first said, hey, I want to do generic actions. I was like, well, you're going to have problems doing that. It's going to be difficult because of this and this and this. And so Jesse's like, all right, you figure it out. And,
that sounds like Jesse.
It sounds like, yeah, that's how Jesse is. And some of the things I like about Jesse is, you know, it's like, yeah, here's a challenge. You figure you solve it.
Yeah.
And then Brian Love and Anthony Jones, who are also Breedbug developers, they helped a lot with the implementation and design of this library. And it's also thanks to Anthony Jones for the name. You know, we had a weird name. I forget what we were calling this library originally, but it was kind of a dumb name. Anthony's like, let's call it auto-entity. And the name stuck because it actually fit really well. And then, of course, Mike, Brandon, and Rob for ngrx. I can't stress enough just how much we love ngrx. I think we started doing this back when ngrx was still, you know, version 1 or even before. And it's become a very fundamental library for us at Breedbug. I mean, pretty much everything we do involves ngrx one way or another. So, and then finally, Thomas Burleson at Google. You know, I found an article from him probably about a year ago about stateful facades, and I'm like, you know what? Facades make a lot of sense for organizing states, and he's done some more presentations and articles on that more recently, and I really want to thank him for getting, you know, a standard design pattern into play with states and with, you know, Angular development in general. So
yeah, he's pretty clever. Thomas was down in Houston a couple years ago and taught an Angular masterclass, and that's actually, and I was learning NGRX before that, but that was actually the first time that I really wrapped my brain around it. And he also taught us the facade pattern back before anybody even started talking about it, and it was really great.
Yeah, it's a great pattern. So thank you very much, Thomas.
Actually,
okay, let me see.
The facade pattern here. A lot of times when I've implemented the facade pattern, sometimes I find it's challenging to make sure that all of the errors bubble up in the same way. And you know, when we write unit tests and that sort of thing to test this functionality, we don't only rely on them to tell us when something's broken, but maybe how it's broken. Do all the same ngrx type errors bubble up through this the generic actions and reducers that you guys provide?
So that's actually an excellent question. And I don't know if I have. What was that?
Your screen share is still on. We can't see you.
Yeah. So before I answer your question, let me dive into two things really quickly. First of all, we have documentation. It's kind of scant right now. It's on breedbug.gitbook.io/ngrx-auto-entity. You can go there and you can find an introduction, a quick start. And then we're adding advanced usage documentation as we go here. And then I also have an introduction article that kind of led to this presentation on Medium. So you can go ahead and hop on Medium and read this article. It goes into a little more depth and has some richer examples with using facades and things like that. But to your question, let me stop my sharing here.
Yeah, I love that graphic there in your post. It's super helpful.
Yeah, thank you. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So to your question about error handling, I don't have a simple answer. And it's actually probably something we should do some more testing around, is to make sure that errors are bubbling up properly. We actually did a fair amount of work around error bubbling. Since we're doing a lot of things automatically, we found early on that sometimes things would just break and the errors were really weird and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And a lot of times it just had to do with, hey, we forgot to throw @key on our key in the model. So we actually have explicit code in ngrx-auto-entity to make sure that you're getting a really friendly message that tells you exactly what's wrong when something is wrong with how you've used ngrx-auto-entity. As for the other errors, I'm actually not really sure. And it's something I'll put on my list to check and make sure that we are bubbling errors up properly. We haven't really changed much in the way you really use ngrx. So if you're dispatching, you dispatch an action the same as you always have, unless you're using an entity facade, I guess. But I will check and make sure that the necessary information is bubbling up properly, because that's a very excellent point. And it's something we've run into in practice, that if you don't have the right error information, it can be rather confusing.
Be careful, Kyler. This is how you become a core contributor.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of which, is this open source, or is this something just Breebug folks are working on? Or?
It's open source. If you want to contribute, I would love it. Yeah. Okay. And by the way, you can actually get to that through github.com/breebug/ngrx-auto-entity. Go ahead and dive in.
Tyler, this is how Jesse offers you a job. Be careful what you wish for.
Right. But yeah, we hope that the community will kind of get involved. And of course, I'll be watching, and some of us will be watching for issues, and we'll take care of those as soon as we can. But if you have ideas, I mean, if you see something that's wrong, yeah, go ahead and fork it and throw a PR in there, and we'll get it in.
It seems like a really cool library, really cool tool. Abstract a lot of the complexity away, make things simpler for everyone to kind of work with and understand.
That's what we're hoping.
I'm actually pretty excited about this because we have, where I work, we have some folks that are getting into Angular and they're loving it. And I think this may help with implementing some kind of state solution there. So I'm pretty excited about this, actually.
Awesome. Glad to hear. I really do. And I want to make sure I stress this. We don't want this to be advanced per se. I really want to make sure that beginners have a path here. I know there's a big push for more and more reactive in the Angular community. And reactive is awesome. Reactive is powerful. And in my opinion, reactive is better. But, there was a question that I saw on Twitter recently about what's the hardest thing with learning in RxJS in general, and reactive coding in general. And there are actually a lot of responses. And it seems clear that reactive programming is not an entry-level thing. And I think that we need to make sure that as Angular moves forward, we don't eliminate a path to entry for beginners. We need to make sure that there's a way that they can kind of ease into reactive programming. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping with auto-entity here, is that we'll provide a simpler approach to reactive state, so that people can kind of start doing reactive state without having to learn all this other stuff in depth and really know it before they get into it. So
I think really there are so many, especially in the United States, because our universities is not what they used to be, right? And you have a lot of self-taught developers. I was self-taught. I took one HTML class and I was like, I don't have time for this. I have a mortgage to pay. And I just jumped out and started learning from books and everything. I mean, I've been self-taught, everything I've done, but I've also been doing Angular exclusively, almost exclusively since 2012 or something like that. So I'm very good with Angular, but there's a lot of that stuff that I had to stumble through and figure out because I have a bachelor's degree in computer science. Now, if I could go back and, redo it all, I would, but I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that there are so many developers, especially in the States, who are self-taught. So we have to make sure that we don't leave them behind.
Right, exactly.
That we don't leave us behind.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I mean, even if you have a degree, a comp sci degree doesn't necessarily mean you understand reactive programming as has been done with RxJS. I mean, it's just there's a lot of complexity there, and there's a lot of it's an inversion of how you might normally think about things. In
It's
general.
definitely a paradigm shift. I love the way Thomas Burleson talked about it in his ngConf talk this year, where he talked about, I think it was called superpowers with RxJS and Facades. But he talks about, he describes it as reactive. We're used to a pool-based architecture where when we want some data, we just go get it. And
Right.
He kind of talks about the paradigm shift to a push-based architecture.
Right.
How we react to things instead of like going to retrieve data. The way he describes it in that talk, it just makes it a whole lot easier to conceptualize. So I actually, as soon as I saw that, I was really excited and took that to work and showed people at work. And I think it really helped people wrap their heads around that because he did a much better job of explaining it than I could have. So.
You know, he was on Angular Air too, talking about that just a week or two ago, the push-based architecture. And he's going to be in Angular Denver in August. I was talking to Brian and Jesse. I was like, I know a lot of people. I could pull some strings. Is there anybody you guys want? And they said, Thomas Burleson.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, okay. So we had to get him.
It really is the way of the future. Yeah. So if I had a few minutes, I wanted to dive into a little bit of code, just kind of because one thing I missed in my presentation was like an actual usage example. So I kind of wanted to get into that really quickly here if I have time.
I don't think we have time because we've got Preston coming up in like 8 minutes.
Okay. Well, then another presentation.
I really do want to see it in code. So if you want to come back and do another, and we have you're going to be on Angular Air next week.
Next week, yeah.
Cool. So are you going to have code samples? Can you show us the code then?
Yeah, I mean, I have it here. I can run through it in like a minute here.
Can you do it in a minute?
Yeah, I can do it in a minute.
Let's do it. All right.
So I kind of touched on state model and stuff in the presentation. I just wanted to give you guys an example of an actual use case. So there's a standard module, all the standard stuff you do for ngrx.
Sharing your screen.
This is pretty much, we just kind of have reduced things down to these .state.ts files, customer.state.ts. This is all you need. We even actually provide a reducer.
You're not sharing your screen, John.
Oh, sorry. Share my screen. That one. All right. So
there we go. So
this is all that you really have to do for state. I mean, you can call this configuration, whatever you want to call it, but this is pretty much it. We actually even do provide
up a little.
Can I make it larger? Yeah, let me make it a little larger. How's that?
That's perfect.
So we provide a ready-made reducer, kind of like we provide a ready-made facade. As it turns out, when you destructure something out of a function call, you cannot use that in a static context. And by that I mean state module here, we're actually referencing the app reducer. That's a static thing that has to be done in a way that can be handled by a directive and the way directive works. So even though we provide a ready-made reducer, you still have to kind of provide a stub reducer, as I call them, like this. Try to get rid of it. Couldn't really do it if you want to make AOT work. But this is kind of all each state file pretty much looks like this. And then your standard reducer file, I think I split these up into two different files for some reason, but your app state interface, you no longer have to write your interfaces for state. You simply use iEntity state customer. iEntity state provides a lot of stuff, and that really is probably something I'll do in a future presentation, is kind of go into the details there. And then, of course, you have your reducer map. You'll notice that I'm destructuring my customer facade base here. And I've extended that here. I can provide additional functionality if I need to. For now, I don't. This is then used in all my components.
That's really beautiful.
Let me actually give you a quick example. Bring in your customer facade. And this is ready-made. I mean, you didn't have to write any of this code. You can hit load all. That'll dispatch the action for you. And then there's access customer facade.all, and then that gets you all your entities. That's your selector right there. You don't actually have to do a pipe or anything like that. You just get it all that way. When you actually need to invoke actions, customer facade.delete, customer facade.select.create.load. It's all there for you, ready to go. You no longer have to think state. You don't have to think store. You just think it's a facade. It has methods that I call, and it's the way you've been coding your entire life. And that's about it. And I do want to do another presentation to get into that more detail. I just didn't want to like code or live code because this kind of ultimately leads to live coding. So.
All right. Well, I think that's where we'll leave it today, and then we will see you next week on Angular Air. And everybody, come back in about 5 minutes for Preston Lamb with ngrx. And no, it's not. I was like, what is he talking about? ngX plug and play, which is going to be cool. And okay, so we'll see you guys in a bit. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks a lot.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.